Have you ever wondered how a woman could disappear from history after defeating 10,000 men? No, this isn't myth. Her name was Khutulun, the warrior princess of the Mongol Empire, a woman whose life bent every rule, challenged every tradition, and yet is barely mentioned in our textbooks. Why? Because power always comes with a price. And Khutulun didn't just possess power, she embarrassed it. Born into the bloodline of Genghis Khan himself, Khutulun was not a footnote. She was a storm. From a young age, she trained alongside men, not in courtly arts or poetry, but in combat, wrestling, archery, strategy. Her father, Kaidu, a descendant of Genghis Khan, ruled a massive territory in Central Asia. But even he, a feared leader of his own, would soon be overshadowed by the strength and cunning of his own daughter. By the time she was a teenager, Khutulun was already riding into battle, wearing the armor of a prince and the eyes of a hawk. But the battlefield wasn't where she shocked the world. That came later. Kaidu had a problem. The Mongol Empire was splintering. After Genghis Khan's death, the empire began to fragment into rival khanates. One of the most powerful was the Yuan dynasty in the east, run by Kublai Khan, who sought to legitimize his reign by aligning with Chinese Confucianism. This brought order, but it also brought a cultural clampdown on women. Female warriors were not just rare, they were unacceptable. But Khutulun refused to play along. She became a legend not only for her battlefield prowess, but for a challenge she issued to every suitor who dared ask for her hand in marriage. The rules were simple. Wrestle her, win, and you marry her. Lose, and you give her 10 horses. That was the bet. And they kept coming. Princes, generals, warriors, one by one. They lined up to claim the warrior princess. And one by one, they lost. Until she owned over 10,000 horses, a living trophy of her victories, paraded before all who doubted her. But then something happened. You see, Khutulun wasn't just a warrior. She was her father's heir. Kaidu had no son strong enough to rule after him. And so he did the unthinkable. He named his daughter as his successor. That was when the real war began. Not on the battlefield, in the shadows. Behind palace doors. Among the bureaucrats and rivals who couldn't bear the idea of a woman wearing the crown of Genghis Khan, rumors began to spread. That she was too masculine. That her victories were exaggerated. That her closeness to her father was unnatural. They mocked her challenges, questioned her honor, and accused her of violating every Mongol and Chinese value. She became a threat not to enemy armies, but to the patriarchy itself. Her own brothers turned on her. When Kaidu fell ill, there was a scramble for succession. Khutulun had the loyalty of the troops, but not the scholars. She had the strength, but not the ink. And in an empire that was shifting toward bureaucracy and paper, ink mattered more than blood. Kaidu died, and with him, her chance. Her brothers took over, carving out their own fiefdoms. Khutulun retreated from the political arena. But what's more disturbing is what happened after she died. The records vanished. In Chinese sources, she's reduced to a name or omitted entirely. In Mongol oral traditions, she lingers as a vague memory, often confused with myth. Marco Polo, who met her in person, referred to her only as the wrestling princess. No mention of her strategic genius. No mention of the 10,000 horses. No mention of the near succession to an empire. Why? Because she challenged the order. Not with rebellion, but with proof. Proof that a woman could lead armies, outwit rivals, command loyalty, outshine her father, and nearly rule the largest empire the world had ever seen. That kind of story doesn't just fade, it's erased. And the people who did it, they knew exactly what they were doing. Even today, historians struggle to reconstruct her life. Fragmented texts, inconsistent timelines, censored records, and always the same pattern. Her story being written by men who feared her legacy more than her sword. But what if we told it again? What if the version you've been taught wasn't the truth? What if Khutulun didn't just beat 10,000 men in wrestling? What if she beat history and history fought back? Khutulun's fame wasn't born in a palace or through arranged alliances. It was forged in the dust of the steppes, where survival meant dominance. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a force that terrified even seasoned generals. By the time she reached adulthood, Khutulun had already defeated dozens of men in wrestling matches, each one a suitor who underestimated her strength, only to be publicly humiliated. These matches were no simple games in Mongol culture. Wrestling was a test of honor, strength, and leadership. For a woman to step into that ring was audacious enough. To win, that was an act of defiance against the very foundations of tradition. And yet, Khutulun didn't just win, she made a spectacle of it. She demanded that every challenger bet horses. 10 horses for every match. By the end, she had amassed a herd of 10,000. That number wasn't just symbolic, it was a power move. Horses were the backbone of Mongol military and economic life. Possessing that many was akin to claiming the wealth and status of a warlord. Whispers spread across the steppes. A princess, more powerful than her brothers, more cunning than most generals. Her father, Kaidu Khan, was no fool. He saw her strength as an asset, not a threat. He relied on her as both a bodyguard and a battlefield advisor. But admiration breeds envy. And within the ranks of Kaidu's allies, there were many who saw Khutulun's rise as a disruption of the natural order. Men who had fought for years to gain Kaidu's trust found themselves overshadowed by his daughter. They whispered that she brought dishonor by rejecting marriage, that her victories in wrestling were staged, that her power was dangerous. One by one, the suitors stopped coming, not out of respect, but out of fear. There was nothing left to gain and too much to lose. Khutulun had turned the courtship ritual into a blood sport, and in doing so, she revealed just how fragile male pride could be. She didn't need a husband, she needed a throne. Then came the wars. Kaidu's empire was locked in a brutal conflict with Kublai Khan, the great ruler of the Yuan dynasty. As the civil war splintered the Mongol empire, Khutulun rode beside her father, commanding troops, devising strategies. She was a ghost on the battlefield, possibly fast, utterly ruthless. Legends say she could pull a man off a horse at full gallop, that her arrows never missed. Soldiers claimed they'd seen her ride into a skirmish alone and emerge with only the enemy's banners. And yet, despite her brilliance, every victory was questioned. Her role in Kaidu's command was downplayed, her strategies credited to others. Some called her Kaidu's favorite child, as if that explained her rank. Others whispered that she used sorcery, seduction, anything but raw military genius. Her enemies didn't need to defeat her in battle. They only needed to erase her afterward. Khutulun never lost on the battlefield. But in the world of politics, the rules were different and the weapons were quieter. She had already out-wrestled 10,000 men. She had commanded troops, advised generals, and ridden side by side with her father Kaidu in the bloodiest days of the Mongol Civil War. But none of that prepared her for the most dangerous challenge of all, inheritance. When Kaidu fell ill, the question of succession ignited a fire no sword could put out. Kaidu had sons, many of them, but none had the loyalty of the army. None had the clarity and strategy, none had the fearsome reputation, except one, his daughter. And Kaidu knew it, in the quiet shadows of war councils and sleepless nights. Kaidu began grooming Khutulun to rule, not as a queen, as a Khan, the first female Khan in Mongol history, a symbol not of tradition, but defiance. She had proved herself more times than anyone could count in wrestling pits, in raids, in the silence that followed her victories. But outside her father's circle, the empire wasn't ready. The generals hesitated. The noble families whispered. The scribes sharpened their quills, not for celebration, but for sabotage. Khutulun was more than just a woman. She was a disruption. A break in the fragile alliance between Mongol authority and Confucian tradition. A threat not to Kaidu's enemies, but to Kaidu's allies. Her brothers watched in silence. And then the silence turned to sabotage. It began with rumors that her victories were fixed, that she used potions or spells, that her father had lost his mind, that her ambitions would doom the house of Gadai, that Khutulun undefeated on horseback was merely Kaidu's puppet in armor. When Kaidu's condition worsened, the knives came out. Meetings were held without her. Decisions signed behind her back. Promises of power were made to others. Her name was quietly removed from records of battlefield victories she had led. And then, just as quickly, the suitors returned not to wrestle, but to save her from the burden of power. They offered marriage. They offered alliances. They offered her a role, a quiet one. She refused, and with that refusal, she sealed her fate. Kaidu died in 1301. Khutulun had the support of the soldiers, but not the scribes. Her brothers, backed by court officials and nervous generals, moved fast. They split the land, they divided the power, and they left Khutulun with nothing but stories. What happened next? That's the mystery. Some say she lived out her days in isolation, bitter but unbeaten. Others say she was poisoned. There's even a version where she agreed, under pressure, to marry a man she had previously defeated just to keep the peace. But the most disturbing version, that she was erased, not just sidelined, not just forgotten, systematically removed from the official history of the empire. The records we have are fragmented, contradictory. Many were written decades later by men who had never met her, who had every reason to minimize her existence. And still, the horses remained, over 10,000 of them, real, documented, living proof of what she achieved. Proof that history, no matter how tightly controlled, cannot completely bury the truth unless we stop asking, unless we stop digging, unless we stop caring. But the question remains, who stood to gain from her disappearance? Why was a woman with the power to unite fractured khanates and revive the dying spirit of Genghis Khan turned into a footnote? And why did every empire after her, from Yuan to Ming, seem so invested in pretending she was never a threat? Maybe they feared what she represented, not just power, but proof that the system could be broken, that a woman, with no permission, no blessing, and no husband, could still command an empire. They called her cursed. They said she disrupted heaven. Maybe that's what happens when the truth threatens the throne. Maybe Khutulun didn't lose history. Maybe history lost her.